Welcome back to the deep dive. We're pushing forward with our journey through the MPEP, the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure.
Yep.
Today we're hitting Chapter 2100, which covers patentability.
And our focus is narrowing down onto Section 2144.
Right, the section dealing with obviousness rejections, so 35 U.S.C. 103 territory.
Exactly. And Section 2144 really lays out how examiners are supposed to justify saying an invention is, well, obvious.
It's not just about finding similar stuff in the prior art, is it? I mean, that seems to be the key takeaway up front.
Absolutely not. That's crucial. They can't just say, look, this feature is here, that feature is there. Section 2144 demands a reasoned rationale.
A reasoned rationale. Okay, unpack that a bit. What does that mean in practice?
It means the examiner has to clearly explain why combining existing bits of technology or, modifying something that already exists would have been obvious.
Obvious to who, though?
To a person having ordinary skill in the art, the hypothetical falsetto at the time the invention was actually made. Not obvious now, obvious then.
Okay. And where does this reasoning come from? Can they just make it up?
No, definitely not. The section says the rationale can be based on things like established scientific principles.
Like laws of physics or chemistry?
Yeah, or things considered common knowledge in that specific field.
Yeah.
Maybe widely known equivalents, like everyone knows you can swap component X for component Y.
Or legal precedent, court cases.
Or legal precedent, exactly. But, and this is important, whatever they use, they have to explicitly explain it and show how it applies to the specific invention they're looking at.
So no generic arguments. It has to be tailored.
Tailored, precisely.
Now, the MPEP mentions a couple of common scenarios like automating a manual process or making something portable. Are those just automatic obviousness triggers?
That's a really good question because it feels like they might be. Oh, you just automated.
Yeah, or you just made it smaller.
Right. But Section 2144 is clear. While those can be reasons for an obviousness rejection, they are not automatic gotchas. There's no per se rule.
So the examiner still needs to explain why that specific automation in that context, using those techniques, would have been obvious.
Exactly. They need supporting evidence or a logical explanation tied to the facts. Just stating automation or portability isn't enough.
Okay, that distinction is important. It's not the general concept, but the specific execution. All right, let's move on to something called inferring motivation to combine. Sounds a bit like mind reading.
Well, it's not quite that. It's about figuring out why a skilled person would have thought to put different pieces of prior art together.
Okay.
Section 2144 says this motivation can often be inferred if combining references A and B would logically lead to some expected benefit.
Like what? Making it cheaper, faster.
Exactly. Improved efficiency, lower cost, better performance. If putting known things together gives you a predictable advantage, the argument goes, someone skilled in the field would likely have been motivated to try it.
It's like the potential benefit itself provides the reason to combine them.
Precisely. And there are some key cases mentioned here, like in Rienecker and Paistar.
What did they establish?
They brought in this idea of the universal desire to improve. Basically, people are always trying to make things better. So that inherent drive can sometimes supply the rationale to combine things, even if no single document explicitly said combine A and B.
Interesting. So the motivation doesn't have to be written down somewhere.
Not always explicitly, no. But there's a catch, right?
I thought there might be. What's the catch?
Well, later cases, particularly in Eli Lilly and the big one, KSRV Teleflex, put some limits on that. They basically said this universal desire logic really only works if the technologies you're combining are, reasonably related. They need to be analogous enough.
So you can't just argue it's obvious to combine, say, spaceship technology with bread making just because it might lead to some improvement.
Exactly. The fields need to be close enough that a person skilled in one would likely know about, or at least look to, the other for solutions. They have to be in the same ballpark.
Right, makes sense. It keeps the reasoning grounded. Now, you mentioned legal precedent earlier. How exactly do examiners use past court decisions?
They could definitely cite cases to support an obviousness rejection. Section 2144 allows it.
But there's always a but.
But the facts of the cited case have to be pretty similar to the facts of the application being examined.
So you can't just grab any case about obviousness.
No. The legal principle or reasoning from the case has to actually fit the specific technological situation and the differences between the invention and the prior art. It needs to be analogous.
You mentioned KSR v. Teleflex again. Why is that one so often cited? It was about car pedals, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, a vehicle pedal assembly. But KSR is a landmark Supreme Court case. The key principle from it is that combining known elements using known methods to get predictable results is likely obvious.
And that idea applies way beyond pedals.
Absolutely. That core logic, combining familiar pieces in expected ways, has really broad applicability across many different technologies. So even though the facts were specific, the reasoning resonates widely.
Okay, so KSR emphasizes predictability and using known elements.
That's a big part of it, yes.
Section 2144 also lists some other specific rationales, right? Things like omitting parts or reversing them.
It does. It outlines several common types of modifications examiners might argue are obvious, like simply leaving out a part if it doesn't really affect the core function.
Or flipping something around.
Reversing parts, yeah. Or just duplicating a part, making two of something instead of one. Even aesthetic design changes. Or purifying a compound that was already known but may be impure.
But for each of those, the examiner still needs the why, right? It's not automatic just because a part was omitted.
Never automatic. That's the constant refrain. For every single one of those scenarios, omission, reversal, duplication, design, purification, the examiner must develop the reasoning. Why was this specific change obvious? Why would a skilled person have done it? What was the expected result? It needs to be fully explained and tied to the application's facts.
It always comes back to that reasoned rationale.
Every time.
The section also includes case examples, like In re Lintner and In re Dillon. How do they help clarify things?
Those examples are super helpful because they show the principles in action. Lintner involved adding sugar to detergent.
Okay. Sounds maybe obvious.
Well, sugar had been used in detergents before, but Lintner was using it for a totally different reason than the prior art. The case highlights that you have to look at the problem the inventor was trying to solve. A known ingredient used for a new, non-obvious purpose isn't necessarily obvious.
Ah, so the why behind the inventor's choice matters a lot. Context is key.
Precisely. Then there's In re Dillon. That one involved similar chemical compounds used in related but different applications.
And the issue there.
It brought focus onto the idea of a reasonable expectation of success. If prior art shows similar chemicals behave similarly in related uses, it might be obvious to try a known chemical in a new analogous use if you'd reasonably expect it to work similarly.
So if it looks like it should work based on what you already know about related things, it leans towards obvious.
If there's a reasonable expectation, yes, that's a factor pointing towards obviousness.
Okay, so pulling all this together, the absolute fundamental thing an examiner has to do under 2144 is what?
They have to explain why. Why the differences between the invention and the prior art would, or sometimes would not, have been obvious to that person skilled in the art, looking at it from the perspective of the time the invention was made. No hindsight, just clear, supported reasoning.
Got it. It's all about articulating that logical bridge between what was known and the claimed invention.
Okay.
Let's quickly recap the key points from this deep dive into section 2144.
Sure. So we've established that obviousness rejections under MPEP section 2144 absolutely require a reasoned rationale. Just listing similarities isn't good enough.
And that rationale needs to be based on solid ground science, common knowledge, equivalence, or legal precedent, and specifically apply to the invention.
Right. We saw that common arguments like automation or portability aren't automatic, obvious findings. They need specific justification.
We also talked about inferring the motivation to combine references, often based on expected benefits, referencing cases like Cernaker and DiceStar.
But also the limitations from Eli Lilly and KSR, requiring the technologies involved to be sufficiently analogous for that desire to improve logic to hold.
And legal precedent like KSR can be powerful, but the facts have to align, even if the core principle about predictable combinations is broad.
We touched on specific rationales like omitting, reversing, or duplicating parts, aesthetic changes, purification, all needing tailored reasoning.
And finally, the case examples like Lintner and Dillon really drove home the importance of the inventor's specific problem and the concept of reasonable expectation of success.
Understanding this need for a well-articulated reason is just fundamental to how patent examination works.
It shapes the whole evaluation process and determines which innovations get protection. Really critical stuff.
Definitely. And it makes you think about how inventors need to approach presenting their work, too.
For sure. Now remember, this was just section 2144 within chapter 2100. There's a whole lot more in the MPEP, so if this was useful, we encourage you to keep exploring the series.
And we absolutely want to give a special thanks to Mike Shepard. He's the creative director who has been organizing and overseeing this entire MPEP audio summary project.
Indeed. Thanks, Mike. And now, our important disclaimer for you. This summary of the MPEP was generated using AI tools, including ChatGPT and Notebook LM. It might contain errors or omissions.
It's really for general educational and informational purposes only. It is definitely not legal advice, and it's no substitute for formal instruction.
For the authoritative word, please always consult the official MPEP itself, talk to a qualified instructor, or get advice from a registered patent practitioner.
And finally, something for you to mull over. Thinking about this requirement for a reasoned rationale, how does that pressure influence the way inventors should actually document their process and frame their arguments to the patent office, specifically to showcase why their invention isn't just an obvious next step?